In this lesson, we're going to have a look at some of the forms and structures in music that come from the United States. Now obviously there's a huge amount of music that comes from the United States, and there's even a number of composers who choose to work in a kind of European style like Charles Ives and Aaron Copland. So for the purposes of this, I'm going to lump those guys in with the European composers because they use a lot of the styles and forms and techniques that we've just been talking about. But there's a lot of music which we might call indigenous music from the United States, and it's absolutely fantastic. I'm the biggest fan of this music, and also I think what's really fantastic about it is it could only have ever happened in America. It could only have happened in the United States because of the amazing mix of people and musical styles and musical backgrounds that existed at that time. Some people might disagree with me, but I'm going to say that this music over the last 100 years or so has become the kind of dominant method of music making and music composition, certainly in the West and possibly throughout the world. This video is all about looking at the forms that those musicians chose to use in their music. And when we look at all of these different styles of music, like blues, jazz, rock and pop music, there's certain things that seem to join them all together. And one thing in particular, and that is the use of a repeating chord scheme. We've looked at chords, we've talked about them as being able to support melodies and add extra colour and excitement to the melodies that composers have written. But in a lot of this music that originates from the United States, it's actually the harmony that defines a huge amount of the music's form. Repeated chord schemes are absolutely central to so much of this music, particularly because it allows the players to improvise really effectively. A quick word about improvisation if anyone's never heard of it. The idea of improvisation is sometimes a little bit confused. Some people think that it's all about making music up on the spot, so you just empty your head of all thoughts and hope that some musical ideas come to you and you can play them. That's a little bit harsh on musicians that improvise, because actually what it's much more similar to is composing music in real time. So it's not to say that you forget everything that you've ever learned about music and just pick some notes at random and hope that those two things fit together. Actually, what you're doing is just the same as what any composer does when they choose to write a melody. You're using your ears and your sense of musical imagination to come up with something new and different. So let's look back to where it all started. Perhaps one of the earliest styles of indigenous music that comes from the United States is the blues. One of the most common forms of the blues is the 12-bar blues. A 12-bar blues is a set chord scheme that everyone playing the music would know. The structure of a 12-bar blues is remarkably simple and requires the player to only really know 3 chords. Just in case the idea of 12-bar blues seems a bit confusing, when we talk of a bar, this is normally a regular grouping of beats. In most blues music, we group the beats into sets of 4. That means that one cycle of this blues chord scheme takes 12 bars or 48 beats. That's 48 beats grouped into sets of 4. So if we divide 48 by 4, we get 12, and those are the 12 bars of the 12-bar blues pattern. Now obviously, just to play this through once would be a very short piece of music. And so in lots of examples of blues music, this pattern is repeated a number of times. It forms the basis over which singers can sing melodies and instrumentalists can improvise. This idea of a repeating chord scheme has extended into lots of other styles of music, most notably jazz. A lot of jazz compositions take the following form. Most of them start with playing the tune or head. This may be a blues, but it may also be another composition. Jazz musicians chose familiar melodies from maybe famous shows or other music that people were likely to know. After the melody or head has been played a number of times by different members of the group, a section is set aside for improvisation. To help the players make sense of this improvisation section, the same chord progression is used that was used for the head. The series of chords in a jazz piece are often called changes. If you can play well over them, it says you know the changes really well. It was pretty customary for each member of the band to have a turn at improvising over these chord changes. This meant that some tunes or head melodies were more difficult to improvise over than others because they required a greater understanding of harmonic changes. Once everyone's had their turn, the familiar opening head melody is used to conclude the piece. It's interesting because even though this is music from a completely different part of the world, there's obviously a feeling among composers that to complete a piece effectively, we need to hear some familiar material from the beginning of the piece. Because this is exactly what we saw in those European composers' works that were using sonata form, where the earlier material is brought back towards the end of the piece. And even as we move forward through rock and roll to rock and pop music, the centrality of changes or repeated chord patterns still defines a huge amount of the music's form. I think most of us understand that lots of this music is based on two main sections, the verse and the chorus. The chorus is often a really memorable repeated section that is the main focus of the song. I think all of us could think of some memorable Michael Jackson or John Bon Jovi choruses and could sing them right now. It's also not uncommon to include a section in a piece like this called a middle eight. In a middle eight, a composer might introduce some slightly different harmonies to avoid the repetition of verse then chorus then verse then chorus becoming too boring and repetitive. There also might be a solo section at this point where a member of the backing group is invited to play an instrumental solo. So with this in mind, you can see the links directly back to the early jazz and blues players, even in the music of the Beatles, Michael Jackson or Justin Bieber, because all of this music does still rely on repeated chord changes. And there's still a place for improvisation to take an important role in the music. But far better than me telling you about all of these different forms, I'd much rather show you how they work. So over the next few videos, I'll be talking you through these musical forms in action.